The night erupts with the crackle of burning thatch and the screams of the doomed. Longships have struck a coastal settlement, and in the smoky chaos, survival is just the beginning of a deeper horror. For the women dragged from their homes, a violent capture was only the first step into a darkness far more complex than a simple death. This video will reveal the layered, systematic ordeal these captives faced, an experience many historians describe as a fate worse than death itself. We will move past the romanticized sagas to uncover a brutal reality built on slavery, forced integration, and the total erasure of a former self. You will understand the true human cost of Viking expansion, pieced together from archaeological finds and stark historical records. What was the journey from free woman to human property really like, and how could a captive's own children become part of the society that enslaved her? The story that follows challenges everything you think you know about the Viking Age. How much of a person can be taken away before nothing of the original self remains? The world she knew was reduced to smoke and screams behind her. For a woman captured in a Viking raid, the immediate horror was just the prologue. Her journey from a person with a name and a home to a piece of property, a unit of trade, began with terrifying speed. Raiders targeted monasteries and undefended coastal villages from Northumbria to Ireland, from Francia to the Baltic shores, not just for silver and relics, but for human plunder. The attack was a whirlwind of calculated violence. Homes were torched, resistance was met with overwhelming force, and anyone who could not fight was a potential commodity. The psychological rupture was instant and total. One moment, you were a daughter, a mother, a wife, with a life defined by family and faith. The next, you were a thing to be grabbed, bound, and dragged away from everything you had ever loved, often forced to watch as it burned. The march to the longships was a procession of despair. Captives were often bound together with rough ropes, or, as archaeological finds in places like Dublin show, with heavy iron shackles. These are not the delicate chains of later eras, but brutal, simple loops designed to secure a human ankle. To find one is to touch the cold, unforgiving reality of the slave trade. The walk to the shore was a gauntlet of physical and spiritual breaking. You were leaving your world behind, and with every step, your old identity was stripped away, replaced by the singular status of Fae. This old Norse word meant livestock, wealth on the hoof. It was the same term used for cattle and sheep, a chillingly clear indication of how these human beings were viewed by their captors. Then came the ship. The iconic Viking longship, a marvel of engineering and exploration, became a floating prison. Captives were stowed amidst the loot, with little shelter from the biting wind and spray of the North Sea. The journey could last for days or even weeks, a relentless ordeal of exposure, seasickness, and starvation. Fresh water was precious, and slaves were last in line. Disease spread quickly in the cramped, filthy conditions. Many did not survive the passage. For those who did, arrival in a foreign land like Norway, Iceland, or the bustling slave markets of Dublin did not mean salvation. It meant the marketplace. Here, you would be inspected, valued, and sold, your price set by your health, your age, your skills. The process was as dehumanizing as the journey. You were no longer a person from a specific place with a specific story. You were now an investment, a labor unit, a body to be put to work. This systematic reduction from human to commodity was the foundational trauma, the essential first act in a life that many sources suggest was a fate truly worse than death. But what happened after the auction block? The story only grows more complex from here. The auction block was just the doorway into a life of unrelenting toil. Once purchased, a captured woman entered the Viking world not as a person, but as a thrall, a piece of living property owned body and soul by her master. Her days were defined by a single, exhausting purpose, labor. If she was sent to a farmstead, which was the fate of most, her world shrank to the brutal cycle of subsistence. She would rise before dawn to feed animals, milk cows, and muck out stables. The back-breaking work in the fields followed, planting, weeding, and harvesting under a sky that offered no mercy. Indoors, she would grind grain for hours on a heavy stone quern, a task that ruined joints and wore down teeth from the grit in the flour. She cooked over open fires, wove cloth on heavy looms, and carried water from distant streams. This was not just work, it was a calculated system of consumption. A thrall was fed the poorest diet, often just gruel and leftover scraps, and housed in the most basic conditions, sometimes in separate, damp outbuildings or even alongside the animals they tended. Their clothing was rough and minimal, just enough to allow work in the harsh climate. They had no legal personhood. Under the law codes, like the detailed Icelandic grugas, a thrall was worth a precise sum, a value listed right alongside the price of a cow or a set of weapons. If a thrall was killed, the master received compensation not for the loss of a human life, but for the destruction of his property. The master held the power of life and death, with the right to punish, sell, or even kill a thrall with little consequence. Physical discipline was a constant threat, a tool to enforce obedience and maximize productivity. Yet within this bleak hierarchy, there were subtle tiers. A field slave faced the hardest, most isolated existence. A woman chosen for household service, however, might have a marginally better lot. Working inside the longhouse, she would be closer to the family, perhaps receiving slightly better food and shelter. She might be tasked with childcare, textile work, or serving at meals. This position carried its own profound psychological weight, however. It required a daily performance of submission, serving the very people who represented the destruction of your old life. You would hear their language, learn their customs, and tend to their children, all while being a visible outsider. This forced intimacy did not grant freedom, it simply changed the nature of the cage. The system was designed to erase the person you once were, replacing your identity with your function. But what happened when that function went beyond labor? What occurred when a thrall, particularly a woman, caught the eye of her owner? The line between property and person was about to blur in the most complicated and devastating way imaginable. The household thrall's life was a prison of routine, but for some women, a far more intimate form of bondage awaited. Beyond the field and the loom, many captured women faced a specific, gendered fate, becoming what the Norse called a frilla, a concubine. This was not a love story from the sagas, it was a calculated system of sexual slavery and a cold tool for social expansion. A Viking man, particularly a wealthy landowner or chieftain, might take a thrall woman as a concubine for several reasons. A free marriage to a woman of equal status required a bride price and formal agreements between families. A concubine required no such investment, she was property he already owned. This practice provided him with sexual access, domestic service, and crucially, more children. In a society constantly pushing the limits of its resources in new settlements like Iceland, population was power. Every child born was a future laborer, a warrior, or a daughter to be married for alliance. The children of these unions, however, occupied a painful middle ground in Viking society. They were born free, not thralls themselves, a status inherited from the father, but they carried the stain of their mother's enslavement. They were often called natural sons or daughters of the bed, and their legal and social status was firmly beneath that of children born to the man's free wife. They could inherit, but usually only a smaller portion, if anything was left after the legitimate heirs received their share. Their path in life was narrower, their honor always slightly questioned. The story of Melkorka from the Icelandic Laxdæla saga poignantly illustrates this brutal system. Melkorka is introduced as a mute Irish thrall girl purchased at a market. She becomes the concubine of a chieftain named Hoskald. She bears him a son named Olaf the Peacock. For years, she says nothing, playing the role of the silent, submissive captive. Only later is it revealed she is actually the daughter of an Irish king, her silence a form of resistance and a preservation of her true identity. Her son Olaf, thanks in part to this hidden royal lineage and his own remarkable qualities, rises to become a great man. But his story is the exception, not the rule. For every Olaf, there were countless unnamed children and mothers whose stories faded into the genetic landscape of the North. This practice of concubinage was a biological strategy. It allowed Viking communities to rapidly increase their numbers in new lands by incorporating the reproductive capacity of captured women. It also introduced new genetic lines, which could be beneficial, but from the perspective of the woman, it was a profound violation layered atop her enslavement. Her body was no longer her own in any sense. It was a resource to be used for the growth of the society that had destroyed her home. Her children, while free, would be raised in the culture of their captors, often knowing little to nothing of her origins. In this way, the practice achieved a terrible kind of integration, weaving captive women and their offspring into the very fabric of Viking society, while systematically unraveling the threads of their past. Yet even within this rigid system, the human spirit sought cracks in the walls. How could a woman navigate such an existence, and was there any path, however narrow, toward something resembling agency? For a woman stripped of her homeland, her freedom, and often control over her own body, the final frontier of conquest was her very soul. The process of cultural erasure was a slow, relentless pressure designed to make a thrall functional and compliant within the Norse world. It began with language. Old Norse would have been a constant, incomprehensible buzz around her, the sounds of commands, gossip, and daily life from which she was excluded. To survive, to understand the simplest order, she would have been forced to learn it, piece by painful piece. With each new word mastered, a piece of her native tongue, the language of her prayers and her lullabies, would have grown quieter in her mind. This linguistic shift was a prison key forged by her own mind, unlocking a basic ability to function while locking away a core part of her identity. Then came the gods. If she was from a Christianized part of Ireland or England, her faith in the one God and his saints was a profound source of comfort and identity. In the Norse household, that faith was not just ignored, it was actively contradicted. She would be expected to participate in the rituals of a pagan pantheon, to make offerings to Thor for protection or to Freya for fertility. The smells of blood from sacrifices, the chanting to idols, the very cosmology of the world tree Yggdrasil would have felt alien and terrifying. Refusal was not an option for a thrall. Compliance in ritual was part of her duties. This forced religious conversion was perhaps the deepest spiritual violation, a demand to abandon the divine framework that gave her life meaning and to outwardly accept the gods of her captors. Her customs, from how she dressed her hair to how she mourned her dead, would have been suppressed or actively mocked. She was expected to assimilate, to become a useful, predictable part of the household machine. Historians call this process social death. It was the systematic severing of every tie to her past. Her old kinship network was gone, either dead or across the sea. In the Norse legal system, she had no kin to claim her or seek vengeance for her. She was a social isolate, her former self erased and replaced by a role, a thrall name given by her master. The archaeological record offers silent, powerful testimony to this erasure. In graves across the Viking world, we find the remains of women buried with Norse-style brooches, weaving tools, and kitchen implements. These are graves of thralls laid to rest by their owners, interred with the items that define their function in Norse society. Conspicuously absent are any personal items from their homeland, no Celtic penannular brooches, no Christian crosses. Their burial was a final act of cultural reassignment, a statement to the community and to the afterlife that this person belonged, in death as in life, to the Norse world. Yet human culture is resilient, and cracks in this system of total erasure sometimes appear. In rare instances, we see subtle hints of cultural retention, whispers of a past identity. Some Norse metalwork from areas of heavy raiding, like parts of Scotland, begins to incorporate intricate Celtic knotwork patterns into its design. A skilled captive craftswoman, putting her hands to work for a new master, might have unconsciously infused her native artistry into the object she was creating. These are faint echoes, but they remind us that the woman beneath the thrall label never completely vanished. She carried her memories, her grief, and her skills within her, a hidden world that the archaeological record can only hint at. But if this was the grim reality for most, what about the extraordinary few? Was there any conceivable path out of this bondage, or was the status of thrall a life sentence written in stone? The phrase, "a fate worse than death," was not mere hyperbole for these women. It was a lived reality, a systematic dismantling of a human being across every possible dimension. It began with the violent rupture of the raid, the terror of watching your world burn. It continued through the dehumanizing march in shackles, the brutal journey across the sea as cargo, and the cold humiliation of the auction block where you were priced like livestock. Survival meant a life of crushing labor where your body was consumed by toil and your spirit worn down by relentless subjugation. For many, it meant the intimate violation of concubinage, where your own children became part of the society that enslaved you, their future a constant reminder of your lost past. And underpinning it all was the slow, insistent erasure of your very soul, your language, your gods, and your customs silenced and replaced. This was not a single act of brutality, but a totalizing process designed to erase the person you were and replace her with a useful, compliant thing. This dark undercurrent forces us to complicate the modern image of the Vikings. While we rightly admire their ships, their explorations, and their artistry, we must also remember that their expansion was fueled by a brutal economy of human suffering. For every saga of a bold adventurer, there were countless untold stories of silent captives whose lives were the price paid for that expansion. Their stories, pieced together from archaeology and grim historical fragments, are a crucial part of the true history. In the comments, we would be curious to know which part of this ordeal you find most difficult to comprehend. If you want more deep dives into the complex, often hidden human stories behind history's biggest events, be sure to subscribe.